With 2.6, we're excited to release the Drake Herald, and it's our first info runner ship. What that really is going to mean is you're going to have these big data banks on the outside of the ship. They're going to have a lot of volume to store, intel assets. This will be stuff, locations of where research data might be found, mining sites, salvage locations, a ship black box. Any of the intangible you could think of is kind of what we're looking at with intel and what an info runner is going to be carrying around.
So one thing when flying around in the Herald that players are going to notice is that the ship is really, really fast. It has, I think, the biggest engines per mass on a ship so far. So if anybody knows what a funny car is or a dragster, it's very dragster. I would assume you're going to see a lot of these in races. Like I said, they're hard to catch, super fast. We got it loaded as well. The players can expect lots and lots of countermeasures. So with all the ships, pretty much any asset. This ship, when I read the specs, the design, the intent of the ship, I usually break out a few keywords, and those will be my motif for the ship. For this ship, I used speed, science, tech, evasion. Also, the motif of Drake had to be integrated in when designing the ship, which is bare bones. It's wires exposed. It's trellis work. It's not as fancy as some of your other branded ships.
Some of the redesign was in part to make sure that we could get everything built to the metric standards that we need for how big guns are, how big components are, how much space a player needs to actually walk in and through the ship. One thing that always looks great in a lot of sci-fi movies are these nice, creepy, crammed corridors, but unfortunately with a lot of game logic, it's like, well, no, we've got to make a little bit more space so your average standing guy can get through and move around stuff. And so you can definitely see that with the interior of the Herald, where just the comm station in the back, the seat for that's going to slide you in and out as you're using the station to optimize the space as much as possible. But then also some of that back wall area was restructured a bit to open up enough room to make sure that even if that seat's extended and someone's getting out of it, another player or an NPC can walk behind that seat cleanly without having to clip into the walls or bounce all over the place.
When we start the design process for the vehicle destruction system, we come in and I will talk with art and design, and we will sort of work out in 2D and 3D how to tear apart the ship. So to start that, I would say, for example, I would look under the model. Now, damage comes in sort of layers, right? It's a bunch of different features that work together. There is the exterior hull of the ship. Underneath the exterior hull of the ship, there is an underlying sort of damaged skin and gubbins. Now, the reason we have this is because now we've added a damage shader that you've probably seen that creates a sort of warping metal sort of effect, and you can punch through and you can see through the ship. That consists of the outer shell, the underlying gubbins, and the actual geometry. Now, all these need to sort of blend together at the end of the day, so part of my process is to check for all the different parts of geometry. I want to check for what are called UVs. UVs are what the texture is placed on. That creates the actual visual of the asset. And then we also have another layer called UV2s, and these are what the damage shader actually works on. We can see that in the editor here over in the top left corner. These would be the UV2s. This is what the damage map shader is actually applied to. So when I shoot the ship, there will be ripples and distortion and metal bending. In conjunction with that, I also have to create little sort of explosive charges around the ship. Now, most of my work is preliminary. Basically, I take the model and I set it up for destruction. So I'll break off the pieces, I'll make sure all the checks and balances are there, and I will prep the work for other people. So for example, the particle guys, I would come up with them next, and I would set these things up called helpers. And helpers are little green cubes. They have direction, they point X, Y, and Z, and they're basically a little explosive charge. Now what I did here is I set up sort of a little group of them, and this group of them is just a bunch of different effects that are generalized and used on different ships. Explosions, sparks, fire, etc., etc. So when a piece takes 100% damage, it pops off, the explosion activates and creates more shader damage. So it's kind of layers. You're peppering the ship with your own guns, you're coming in, parts are exploding off, it's all melting, and at the end of the day, you should have a pretty broken looking ship. So if we come in, I'll start hiding some pieces. So I will come over here. We've gone into Max and we've done some initial ship setup. We've checked that the mesh has UV2s. We've checked that the mesh has underlying geometry for the shader to show underneath when bullet holes are taken into effect. The shader's pretty cool with the damage system in that the shader actually lets you poke holes in the meshes with what are called vertex colors. So when I go into Max, I go onto the mesh and I start setting areas where there's translucency, transparency, etc., for damage to shoot through. Not every area does need to be shot through though. You need to make sure that you're not wasting extra geometry, costing performance, adding, internal structure to places that don't need it. But you also want to make sure that every piece blows off, has a neat effect, looks pretty cool when it's flying off, so on and so forth. As you see, some pieces are floating away, some pieces are kind of just sitting around. Those are called vectors, and those are little force pushes that are set in the XML. That tells the piece how hard it should fly off the ship and in what direction. As I come in, I just keep going around the ship looking for areas that are not working correctly. So this area, for example, is working correctly. We see we are getting bullet holes. The procedural system is working, UV2s are working, so on and so forth. But an area that I know it doesn't really work is up here. If we take a look, we see we're kind of getting a bullet hole, but nothing really going on there. Well, that means I have to go back into Max and kind of figure out why. Maybe reproject the UV2s, so on and so forth. Like I was saying, testing different weapon types, seeing how they affect the damage, testing different lighting conditions, making sure all the pieces blow off, all that fun stuff. But pretty much, in closing, that's how we put together some of the damage. It's a mix between 3D Studio Max, XML, and the CryEngine. It's a very iterative process, going back and forth until it's refined, and then you hand it off to the professionals at the end, and they sort of tweak the graphic, the sort of VFX, they tweak the explosions, health, damage, and lighting. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed.